Here's how the president and CEO of the company selling Seresto Flea and Tick collars responded to those numbers, which again are 100,000 incidents and over 2,300 deaths. Although the committee report said that the death count is over 2,500 now. But here's Jeffrey Simmons, the CEO of Elanco Animal Health Incorporated.
Adverse event reports are not intended to be, and in fact are absolutely not, proof of causation. Reports require further investigation and analysis to determine cause. And after years of review, our pharmacovigilance team, made up of veterinarians and other experts who study adverse event reports, has not identified a single death caused by the active ingredients in the collar.
Not one. Canada, the EPA, they find causation likely in literally hundreds of individually studied cases. But the in-house scientists in the company find zero. This is why we need government to police businesses, because that is simply absurd.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 256th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, especially if you are discovering this podcast through my new podcast, We're Not Wrong, which I co-host with Justin Robert Young and Andrew Heaton, welcome to my very wonky world over here. I've been doing Congressional Dish now for about 10 years because I wanted to know what Congress was doing with my money and in my name, and I discovered that Congress is an excellent window to the world. And so for this podcast, I do read bills and laws, but I also watch and listen to a lot of congressional hearings because I've discovered that there is important information that directly affects our lives being discussed in the halls of Congress with experts who are called to provide their knowledge under oath. And so many of these hearings are somehow not being covered in the nightly news. And I really do struggle to understand how Washington, D.C. can be crawling with journalists desperate to consume talking points fed to them in press conferences who are ignoring these congressional investigations happening just down the street. In fact, these investigations that are happening online, because I don't live in Washington, D.C., I never have. I get all of these hearings from YouTube, sometimes C-SPAN, and the Senate has a very weird program, but you can watch the Senate hearings online too. They're just a little harder to download. But unless the hearing is closed to the public, you can even do this online. You don't even have to be in Washington, D.C. And yet, somehow these hearings are being ignored. And this hearing I'm going to highlight for you today is the perfect example of that. Because the issue under investigation in this committee is a matter of life and death for creatures that you love. I'm talking about your pets. Now, it's no secret that I'm currently traveling through this life with a sweet little puppy in my backpack. Although she's not really a puppy anymore. She's 9 years old. But I found Abby, my 8-pound, amazing, quiet, snuggly Maltese, while walking on a bike path. I was actually listening to a final edit of a Congressional Dish episode when I found her on Halloween of 2015. The way that I found her, just real quick, is that I was walking down the path and I saw this little dog all by herself, running around, wearing a Halloween costume. and she wasn't with anyone who was taking care of her. She wasn't on a leash. And so long story short, I figured out which house she had escaped from. And while grilling the lady who was at the house, because at this point I'm like, who is this bad dog owner that lost this dog? Well, it turned out she was fostering Abby, and Abby had been wearing a cone around her neck. And when they took the cone off, they didn't realize that she was so small that she could slip under the fence. And so then I got to chatting and found out that this dog was considered perfect by her foster. And so this woman wasn't allowing Abby to go to just anyone. She was looking for the perfect person. And it turns out Abby was the perfect dog for me because we had 4 criteria that we wanted in a dog. And it was, we wanted one that was small enough to fit in a backpack to travel with us. We wanted one that had hair instead of fur because my dad is allergic to dogs and I spend a lot of time at his house. I wanted a dog that was quiet, not a little yappy thing because I am a professional podcaster. And then my husband wanted a dog with a snaggletooth. And here's this little dog who appeared before we were ready for her, but she met all of those criteria. And I wanted this dog. I knew I loved her immediately. And so basically, I had to get rip-roaring drunk on cheap wine with these two British women. Even though I'm allergic to wine, I was quite sick the next day. But I ended up becoming their best friends, convinced them that Joe and I were the perfect people to adopt Abby. And so now she has been our travel partner for quite a few years. But Abby's my first dog. I don't know what I'm doing here. And shortly after adopting her, my husband and I moved to an island in the Bay Area named Alameda, lovely little place. And we moved across the street from a beach that was infested with fleas. And we noticed this because Abby was scratching all the time. And then this one horrible day, I spotted the first of many little black bugs. And I freaked the out because did you know that fleas can jump? They can jump right off your dog and onto you. And that just could not be in my home, especially considering that one of the terms of our adoption was that we had to promise that Abby would be allowed to sleep with us in our bed. And I didn't want a dog with fleas in my bed. And so it became very urgent for us to find a way to get these damn fleas off our dog. And so I went to the pet store. Pretty sure I went to Petco. And I was just overwhelmed with the choices that I had for how to get fleas off of this dog. There were flea collars, there were creams that you could put on the dog, and then there were pills. I was uncomfortable with the pill option for two reasons. One, I didn't know what this medication was. And two, it was expensive. The creams just seemed kind of gross. And so we landed on the Seresto Flea and Tick collar, mainly because it was the most affordable and it was one that could stay on her for 8 months. We wouldn't have to buy it and change it all of the time. So I put it on her, and within a couple of days, I started getting some headaches, which, as long-term listeners know, I do have issues with my eyes. And so it could have been a lot of things, but I did notice that I was getting headaches. But I was just constantly looking at the gray plastic collar around her neck with suspicion because this thing can kill bugs. And I don't sleep with a citronella candle, I'm just a little bit wary of having things near me that are meant to kill other creatures. And here's little Abby, who's always jumping up and snuggling with us in our bed. And as much as I didn't want fleas in my bed, I also didn't want poisons in our bed. And so I didn't like the idea of this collar. And so after voicing my concerns to Joe, he convinced me that we should try the pill kind of flea medication. And so we took the collar off, we put it in a drawer where it stayed until we moved 3 years later. I didn't think anything of it. I was like, if we need this collar, at least it'll be here. But Abby started taking her Next Guard pills for fleas. The fleas went away, and she's been fine on that medication ever since. But it's this story that made me stop what I was doing when I saw that Seresto Flea and Tick collars were the subject of a congressional hearing. That fact, the fact that I put that on my dog, that I slept for at least 2 or 3 nights with it right next to me and had it in my house for years, I decided I had to move this topic to the front of the line. Because the Seresto Flea and Tick collars, they are the #1 flea and tick collar on Amazon right now. In fact, on Amazon, it's even cheaper than what I paid. It's about $50 now instead of $75. But these collars are also available at Petco and PetSmart and Chewy.com, 1-800-PET-MEDS, Walmart. These things are everywhere. And if my paranoia about those collars was actually justified, to that day that I saw the hearing, I didn't know, which means that you might not know, and you might have one of these collars on your pet right now. And here's an example of why that might be a big problem. Here is a random American who testified in a hearing that took place a few weeks ago on June 15th in the Committee on Oversight and Reform's Subcommittee on Economic and Consumer Policy.
My name is Thomas Maiorino. I reside in Mount Laurel, New Jersey with my wife, Monica. the father of 3 boys. My youngest son, Robert, turned 12 in 2011. After years of asking for a dog, he wore us down and we decided to rescue a dog from a southern shelter for my son's birthday. After researching online, we adopted a mixed breed mutt that Robbie and his 2 other brothers named Rooney. Rooney swiftly became a loved member of our family. A bit rambunctious, she was just what a 12-year-old boy needed. She loved to run, chase anything that moved in the yard. By all measures, we took great care to ensure Rooney had a healthy and happy life. We took her on daily walks, sometimes 3 a day, hikes on park trails. We monitored her diet, made sure she was seen by the veterinarian as needed, and she received all of her shots. Because she was a bit rambunctious and we lived in a wooded area where there's a lot of wildlife, we were constantly concerned about the problems of fleas and ticks. We consulted with a veterinarian after getting Rooney to determine the best way to protect her against this. We used a variety of prevention methods for the first few years, and when we changed veterinarians in approximately 2013 or 14, the new veterinarian strongly recommended that we use the Seresto Flea and Tick collar based on all of our options. We heeded that advice and purchased Seresto collars from our local PetSmart. The collars were intended to provide protection for up to 8 months. We noticed that after fixing a collar to Rooney's neck, she began to itch and at first had that treated and tested for allergies. We took Rooney to the vet several times during 2018, seeking to find the cause for the ever-increasing itching. After several visits and multiple medications, they were unable to determine the cause, and we switched to a specialist in 2019 to seek further assistance, where they provided allergy shots and other medications to address the worsening itching and related symptoms. Rooney's behavior then became more erratic as the months wore on. She began licking her paws so feverishly they would bleed. She also developed bleeding patches on her stomach. Ultimately, in October 2020, Rooney suffered a horrendous grand mal seizure in the presence of myself and my wife. The damage done by the seizure was irreversible. She was a shell of her former self, and ultimately, the family decided the most humane thing would be to put Rooney to sleep at the age of 9. In early March 2021, I read an article online about Seresto pet collars resulting in the deaths of 1,700 pets without any warnings from the EPA or the manufacturer. I sought out legal representation, not because I wanted financial compensation, but because I took great pain to care for Rooney. The final 18 months of her life were agonizing to watch. If I could help prevent another family from going through what my family went through, I wanted to act. I'm here today in furtherance of that effort. I appreciate the committee taking the time to investigate this matter, and thank you for your time.
The hearing that started with that testimony, and similar testimony from a woman who was crying so much that her story was just too jumbled for this show, but the hearing took place as the result of a 16-month investigation conducted by this subcommittee, during which they collected and analyzed documents from the Environmental Protection Agency and the companies that have been profiting off of the Seresto collars for almost a decade. The committee just released their first report, which is only about 25 pages long, and I've put it in the show notes for you if you want to read it for yourself. But this hearing was to discuss their findings with experts. The Seresto Flea and Tick collars for dogs and cats that were the subject of the investigation were put on American shelves by Germany-based multinational corporation Bayer in 2013. Unlike other flea and tick collars and cream treatments, which have to be changed or reapplied monthly, the Seresto collars packaging recommends that the collars be left on the pet for 8 months. At $70 per collar, that's less than $10 a month. And if safe, that would be one of, if not the most affordable options available to keep fleas and ticks off of your pets and out of your home. And like I said before, that affordability factor was the main reason that a Seresto collar ended up around my Abby's neck. And a lot of other pet necks. There have been about 34 million Seresto collars sold in the United States. Here's the president and CEO of the company that currently is selling these collars to Americans, Jeffrey Simmons of Elanco Animal Health Incorporated. And here's what he wanted to say to Congress about the Seresto collars.
There are a few points I'd like to emphasize up front. First, the EPA approved Seresto following more than 80 safety and toxicity studies, all of which show that Seresto and its ingredients have a strong safety profile. Second, more than 80 regulatory bodies around the world have approved Seresto. Seresto is widely used in more than 80 million collars worn over the past decade to protect dogs and cats from fleas and ticks around the world.
It is true that studies were conducted before the Seresto collars appeared on pet store shelves in the United States. And it is true that they got approval to be there from the Environmental Protection Agency. But scientists at the Environmental Protection Agency were upset about the inadequacies of their own review processes. Here's Karen McCormick, and I'll let her tell you who she is.
My name is Karen McCormick. At the present time, I am a retired government employee after working over 40 years at the Environmental Protection Agency. During my career at EPA, I first worked in an EPA laboratory as a research coordinator, and in that capacity, I conducted research on numerous pesticides. Later, I transferred to EPA's headquarters in Washington, D.C., and worked in various positions in the pesticide program as a scientist, policy analyst, and a communications officer. I also worked in a number of offices at EPA, including the Office of the Assistant Administrator for Pesticides and Toxics. Although I'm retired from EPA, I'm still closely following a number of environmental topics. And one of those topics of interest to me has been the impact of flea and tick pet products on cats and dogs.
And here's what she says is going on.
The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is charged with regulating products that contain pesticides and in ensuring that all pesticide products are safe to use. Before 1996, EPA did not consistently require manufacturers to conduct animal safety studies for pet products containing pesticides. Because pet products with pesticides were available readily in commercial stores, consumers thought they must be safe. This is not necessarily the case. Flea and tick products are designed to kill insects, and they often contain poisonous chemicals. When combined with pesticides that are used outside the home and in the water and food that people drink and eat, the aggregate risks from all these sources of pesticides can be high, especially for children who are vulnerable to toxic chemicals, much more vulnerable than adults. And it wasn't until the passage of the 1996 Food Quality Protection Act that EPA began to examine the risks from sources other than food, including risks from pet products containing pesticides. After the passage of FQPA, pesticide manufacturers were required to submit to EPA animal safety studies and incident reports showing harm to animals and humans exposed to pesticides and pet products. Between 2012 and the present time, the EPA received an increasing number of incident reports related to the use of flea and tick pet collars for dogs and cats. The toxic effects that were described in these many incident reports from the use of certain pet collars range from mild effects, such as skin irritation, to more severe effects, such as intense tremors, seizures, paralysis, organ failure, and death. The largest number of incident reports that EPA received during this period were from the use of pet collar called Seresto.
And here's what she had to say about the studies that led to EPA's approval of the Seresto flea and tick collars.
There are no independent organizations that rank the safety of pet products, and the sales data, which is needed to rank the safety of pet products, is considered confidential business information by the manufacturers. EPA's risk assessments also do not tell the full story of what pet products are safe, as they rely heavily on industry-generated studies that were conducted on mice and rats rather than dogs and cats. And EPA's risk assessments also are based mainly on studies that were conducted with only one pesticide in Seresto rather than the combined pesticides in this pet product.
You see, there are quite a few flea and tick collars, creams, and medications on the market. Again, what makes Seresto different from those other flea and tick collars is that the Seresto collars have 2 active ingredients. They have 2 pesticides that kill fleas and ticks. These are tough for me to pronounce: imidacloprid and flumethrin. No other product has this combination of pesticides. Like former EPA scientist Karen McCormick said, tests of ingredients are often conducted on rats and mice. But EPA knows that one of the ingredients, imidacloprid, makes dogs sick at doses 7 times lower than the doses that rats and mice can withstand. And as for the other active poison on the collar, flumethrin, it was only tested on rats and mice. its standalone effect on dogs and cats, as far as the EPA is concerned, is still unknown. And Seresto is the only product that contains flumethrin as an active ingredient. That fact alone tells me that the studies are clearly incomplete. But as Karen McCormick testified, the majority of the studies were looking at each pesticide individually. But again, what makes Seresto unique is the combination of those two pesticides. A 2012 study conducted by Bayer, the company that invented the Seresto collars and sold them to us up until just a few years ago. Well, Bayer's internal study found that the two pesticides in the Seresto collars together have a, quote, synergistic effect, unquote, meaning that they are more toxic together on fleas. And so the company acknowledges that the combo is a more lethal killer when it is a useful advertisement for their product. But if the combo is more toxic for fleas, couldn't that mean that the combo is more toxic to pets and people? The EPA didn't require anyone to check. And there were other important studies that never happened as well.
Although the original manufacturer, Seresto Bayer, did conduct a number of efficacy and safety studies on dogs and cats treated with Seresto, the company did not conduct two very critical studies that are important for determining the safety of a pet product. These tests include a pet transferable residue study, a petting study, to determine the exposure of humans to Seresto, and they did not conduct a study that measures the amount of pesticide that gets in the blood of treated dogs and cats.
And so, using incomplete studies, all conducted or paid for by the company trying to get the product approved, the Obama administration's EPA allowed Bayer to sell the Seresto collars to Americans. But reports of illnesses and deaths started rolling in right away, leading the EPA to conduct an investigation within 2 years of the introduction of the Seresto Flea and Tick collars into the U.S. market. Here's Representative Raja Krishnamurthy of Illinois. He's the chair of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform Subcommittee on Economic and Consumer Policy, which is the committee that conducted this investigation.
As early as 2015, just a few years after the collar entered the U.S. market, an EPA investigation found that among similar products, the Seresto collar, quote, ranked number 1 by a wide margin in terms of total incidents, major incidents, and deaths, even after factoring in companies' relative sales. Those findings weren't enough to drive the makers of Seresto collar or the EPA to act.
And for what it's worth, the products in the number 2 and number 3 spots for most dangerous to pets are also Bayer products that just about any dog and cat owner has probably heard of or tried: Canine Advantix and Frontline. Just something to keep in mind. But after discovering that Seresto was by far the most dangerous product for pets on the market during their 2015 investigation, the EPA decided to wait and, quote, monitor the situation, unquote, while Canada finished an analysis on the safety of Seresto collars that they were conducting at the same time, using a lot of the same data from the United States. Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency decided to investigate the Seresto collars because if there are a certain number of reports about products causing harm, in Canada that triggers a mandatory investigation. Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency used the threshold of 1 incident per 10,000 collars sold as an indicator of a potential problem and as their investigation trigger. The 15 flea and tick collars that were registered for sale in Canada at the time averaged 0.07 incidents per 10,000 collars sold, so they were fine. But the Seresto collars had an incident rate of 36 to 65 incidents per 10,000 collars sold, way over the threshold of 1. And even just the most serious reports alone would have triggered a Canadian investigation. There were 3 to 5 death and major incidents per 10,000 collars sold. And so Canada launched an investigation.
Canada's analysis was very scientific. It was not only based on incident data and sales data, it was based on the toxicity of the 2 pesticides in Seresto. And they looked at the consistency and what happened eventually with the pets that were exposed to Seresto.
And so Canada's investigation was clearly more thorough, looking at that combo of poisons in the Seresto flea and tick collars. When looking into what happened to the pets, the Canadians differentiated the reports into two categories. First, there were incidents, which meant that the pets were sick but still alive, at least at the time the report was collected. The symptoms in these pets appeared quickly in most of the cases, within a month of the collar first being put on the pet. The most common symptoms were that almost 80% of the animals suffered from at least one skin effect, and these included open sores and red and irritated skin that often covered the animal's entire body and required medical treatment. If you go to Amazon right now and you look in the reviews section of pretty much any Seresto flea and tick collar for any kind of animal, check out the pictures. You'll see plenty of examples of severe rashes around the animal's necks and some of them covering the animal's entire body. It was also common for incident reports to include neurological problems, lethargy, weird behavior, excessive licking, vomiting, diarrhea, and refusing to eat. And over a third of the cases reported more than one of those symptoms at a time. Of the cases in the incidence category, 5 to 10% of those cases involved convulsions, muscle tremors, and loss of control of bodily movements. And 10% of the pets in this category had to be euthanized later because of the severity of these symptoms, which didn't go away when the collar was taken off. The damage had already been done. The Canadians also showed in their 2016 report that it wasn't just pets who were getting sick. The report closely analyzed 106 human incidents and found that 83% of them were probably caused by the Seresto collar. And just like with pets, human symptoms appeared quickly, often the day that the human opened the box with the collar in it. Half of the humans reported skin problems. About 15% had more serious symptoms that included trouble breathing, upset stomach, dizziness, and neurological problems. And about 40% of the humans needed medical treatment. Canada noted that these human symptoms closely mirrored the known effects of one of the two main poisons used in the Seresto collar, imidacloprid. And then finally, during their investigation, the Canadians closely reviewed 961 death and major pet incidents and found that the Seresto collar probably or possibly caused 737 of them. Put another way, 77% of the deaths were probably caused by the Seresto collar. And they found that incident numbers had doubled nearly every year since the product had appeared on American shelves in 2013. When Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency finished their report in 2016, it concluded in no uncertain terms that Seresto flea and tick collars are a poisonous product, and Canada refused to approve the collars for sale, deeming them too dangerous to be allowed on Canadian shelves. Canada conducted their study in large part using our EPA data. In fact, when the EPA looked at the same data, our EPA actually found a higher likelihood that the Seresto collars were the cause of the sicknesses and deaths. Remember, EPA said that even though their 2015 investigation found the Seresto collars to be dangerous, they were waiting for the Canadian report to make their decision about what to do here in the United States. Canada concluded these things were poison, said they can't be sold in Canada. And so after that, our EPA did nothing. Millions of us bought the Seresto collars after that, including me, knowing none of this, and we're still buying them today. And here's what's happened in the meantime.
Between January 2012 and the present time, EPA has received over 100,000 incident reports, and these incident reports include human incidents as well as pet incidents. These reports also include at least 2,300 reports of pet deaths. The number is most likely a very low estimate of the actual number of incidents that are occurring, since many pet owners do not know that they can report incidents to EPA, and they may not know how to correlate the adverse effects in their pets with a particular pet product.
And here's how the president and CEO of the company selling Seresto flea and tick collars responded to those numbers, which again are 100,000 incidents and over 2,300 deaths. Although the committee report said that the death count is over 2,500 now. But here's Jeffrey Simmons, the CEO of Elanco Animal Health Incorporated.
Adverse event reports are not intended to be, and in fact are absolutely not, proof of causation. Reports require further investigation and analysis to determine cause. And after years of review, our pharmacovigilance team, made up of veterinarians and other experts who study adverse event reports, has not identified a single death caused by the active ingredients in the collar.
Not one. Canada, the EPA, they find causation likely in literally hundreds of individually studied cases. But the in-house scientists in the company find zero. This is why we need government to police businesses, because that is simply absurd. Here's Nathan Donnelly, the Environmental Health Science Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. Here's what he thought about this zero stat that was being provided to Congress.
This is what we commonly see, quite frankly, when the regulated industry is doing their own research. It commonly finds that their products are safer than when government agencies or academic scientists take on a similar analysis.
We need our government to do their own studies. There is clearly too wide a discrepancy in the results between what company-produced studies are finding and what government studies are finding. And this is a problem that goes far beyond collars for dogs and cats. We've seen this with environmental studies, definitely with banking reports. This seems to happen anytime companies are allowed to self-police. And in an era of deregulation, there's a lot of self-policing going on. And as for how the EPA is regulating pet pesticides now, here's Nathan Donnelly again, who I will allow to introduce himself more fully.
My name is Dr. Nathan Donnelly. I'm the Science Director for the Environmental Health Program at the Center for Biological Diversity. I have a PhD in Cell and Developmental Biology from Oregon Health and Sciences University. The last 7 years of my professional life have been spent researching how pesticides impact people and the environment, and the regulatory failures that can actually facilitate harm rather than prevent it. I published 3 peer-reviewed scientific articles and 5 technical reports on this subject. I've authored over 100 technical scientific comments to the EPA on pesticide documents, including for flumethrin and imidacloprid, the 2 active ingredients in the Seresto collar. I've read through thousands of pages of FOIA documents I requested on matters related to the approval and continued use of Seresto.
So this guy knows things. And here's what he said is our current situation with the EPA.
While other agencies like the FDA have robust systems in place to surveil harms from products under their purview, EPA only requires minimal information be submitted 4 times a year. And they delegate this responsibility to the pesticide industry itself. The limited information that is collected includes only the pesticide product name, where the incident occurred, and the severity of the incident. That's it. Oftentimes, the agency doesn't even know if the incident involves a dog or a cat. Even though the EPA determines what incident information it collects, it then turns around and laments that the incident data are insufficient to take regulatory action to protect public health, the environment, and our pets. It's a system designed to achieve nothing other than maintaining the status quo. Worse yet, reported incidents significantly underestimate the true scope of harm. The EPA recently estimated that only 1 in 25 pesticide incidents involving another pesticide called dicamba was actually reported to the authorities. That's only a 4% reporting rate. Given that 100,000 people have reported their concerns about Seresto, this is very alarming because the true number of harmful incidents to pets could be potentially far higher.
And it turns out that nothing about what Dr. Donnelly told Congress about the EPA's incident reporting problems is breaking news. The problems with the EPA system for collecting incident data on pesticides have been known for decades. In a 1995 Government Accountability Office report, the GAO highlighted the fact that reporting was voluntary for everyone except the company that made the product as an important factor contributing to underreporting. In the 1990s, the EPA wasn't requiring state or local governments, private organizations, or customers to report incidents and deaths suspected to be linked to pesticides. It was only if the product's manufacturer learned of an incident, for example, if a customer voluntarily reported the incident to the company, only then was a report required to be turned in to the EPA by the company. And as for what was in those reports, companies were not required to provide EPA with important details about incidents. They were allowed to leave out key details like when the pesticide exposure occurred, the amount of exposure, and the symptoms experienced. GAO concluded at the time that the agency's pesticide incident reporting system, quote, did not currently ensure that the EPA has sufficient information to determine whether action to protect public health is necessary, unquote. And so, in 1997, the EPA updated their rules. The 1997 rule change is the most recent update to the reporting rules. And the problem is, it really didn't change very much. The 1997 reporting rule that EPA issued didn't address most of the major problems identified by the GAO report. The new rule requires that companies only need to report 2 pieces of data from incidents linked to their pesticide products. They need to report the total number of incidents and whether the incident was a death, major, moderate, or minor incident. The real-world effect is that, let's say a cat or a dog experiences vomiting and a skin rash after wearing a flea collar for a week, and their human reports these symptoms to the collar's manufacturer. Well, at that point, the company is only required to report that this incident happened, along with all of the other incidents over a 3-month period. And they only have to categorize it as a major, moderate, or minor incident, depending on how the company itself chooses to classify the dog's symptoms. By the time the incident report arrives on EPA's radar, it is stripped of all the details and useful information. And so basically, as far as EPA is concerned, there's no universal duty to report illnesses and pet deaths. There's no central reporting point for all incidents. There's no requirement for active monitoring of incidents after they happen. And there's no requirement for important details about each incident to be shared with the EPA. And so when the EPA says that they don't have enough information to act, this is why. They don't have much information in general. Now, obviously, all of this makes the EPA look very bad. Makes them look like a cop caught sleeping in the bathroom at a donut shop. But not all EPA cops were on board with the, let's just ignore this plan. Here's the chair of the committee again, Representative Krishnamurthy, speaking to former EPA scientist Karen McCormick.
We have FOIA documents from the EPA and emails internal to the EPA talking about the Seresto collar. Here's just one of them. This is from an employee who basically voiced their opinion about recent coverage of the Seresto controversy. He said, looks like the shit has hit the fan. Will be interesting seeing where this goes. I hope there is a FOIA for all communications on this so that our emails are made public. We have been screaming about Seresto for many years. I presume that you've heard some of these screams and concerns, correct, Ms. McCormick?
That's correct. A number of EPA employees have contacted me and given me detailed descriptions about what's happening with Seresto, and they were very upset that EPA refused to do anything about it.
And that is an accurate classification of what went on during the Obama administration, because despite Canada's findings that the collars were dangerous and the internal outrage at the EPA, Obama's EPA chose to do nothing. And then in 2017, a new administration took over the law enforcement branch of the U.S. federal government, including the EPA. And I am talking about the administration of notoriously corrupt businessman Donald J. Trump. And the Trump EPA decided that the best thing to do about the Seresto collar situation was to shut the outraged EPA scientists up. During the first year of Trump's corporation's first administration, acting on orders from a senior EPA official, an EPA scientist demanded that 2 other EPA officials stop expressing their concerns about Seresto over email. But the emails didn't stop, because in 2018, the concerned EPA scientists saw increases in deaths linked to Seresto collars that they refused to ignore. So in the second quarter of 2018, 125 pet deaths were reported, which one concerned EPA scientist called, quote, the highest number we've ever seen, unquote. Until the third quarter of 2018, when that record was broken when they received reports of 148 deaths. The scientists calculated that there were more pet deaths linked to Seresto through the first 3 quarters of 2018 than in all of 2017 combined, and noted that the Seresto collar was, quote, the only product where we are seeing this trend, unquote. And instead of acting on those concerns, the Trump EPA told them to stop saying this stuff in writing, which is pretty on brand for the Trump administration. But after that especially tragic year for the Seresto collar-wearing pets, Bayer, the company that was still creating and selling Seresto collars at the time, and the EPA met in 2019 to discuss changing the warning labels on the Seresto collars. Now, there was apparently no discussion about taking these dangerous products off our shelves, even after that's what Canada had decided to do years earlier. But maybe after the increasing deaths, they would warn the American people of at least a few of the dangers. Because after all, Bayer, which is a Germany-based multinational corporation, had updated the warning label in Germany to include a warning about the neurological risks to humans and pets. But the EPA, which characterized its relationship with Bayer in those meetings, not as product police and suspect, but instead as a partnership, well, they asked their partners at Bayer to pretty please update the label, quote, in the spirit of stewardship, unquote. And Bayer said no. EPA also, aware of its massive gaps in data collection, asked Bayer to split up the registrations into two. They wanted one registration for dog collars and one for cat collars so that the EPA could better track the incident data by species. But Bayer said that it would lead to more fees and a, quote, administrative burden, unquote. And again, told the EPA, in the politest of corporate speak, to kindly right off. And Trump's EPA responded to those hard no's to their pretty pleases with, quote, thank you for considering it and for your explanation of the difficulty such an action would have at this time, unquote. And that was that. The collars continued to be sold to Americans with no change to the warning label, which on the outside of the package, even today, says only to keep it out of the reach of children, which is kind of interesting considering I'm pretty sure children do touch their pets. And also, just even that little warning about the children is also in much smaller font than the part of the box that says these are, quote, veterinarian approved, unquote. And so after that nothing burger of a 2019 meeting between Bayer and the EPA, Bayer got out of the Seresto business, selling that part of their company for over $6 billion to Elanco Animal Health Incorporated, whose CEO you've been hearing from today. The collars instantly became their top selling product. But then finally, in March of 2021, 8 years after the Seresto Flea and Tick collars were put on American shelves, where Americans finally warned about the dangers, when an article was published about the dangers posed, known about, and ignored by the EPA in a widely read newspaper, USA Today. Everybody has heard of USA Today, and a lot of people read that article. Here's Representative Hank Johnson of Georgia speaking to that guy who's been studying this nonstop for the last 7 years, the Environmental Health Science Director at the Center for Biological Diversity, Nathan Donnelly.
And the only reason that the public knew about the harm caused by this pesticide is because the Center for Biological Diversity publicly petitioned the EPA to cancel registration for Seresto flea collars. If they had not brought this to light, do you think we would even know of the dangers presented by these collars?
No, we wouldn't. The investigation that came out in USA Today in 2021 really brought this to the public attention. And if there wasn't that amount of pressure from the public, this would just still be completely unknown. EPA for the last 10 years has not done anything to alert consumers to the harms associated with this product or any other pesticide products where there are a very high number of incidents.
And so, in the absence of any action from the EPA, it was journalists who gave us this information. Journalism for the win. That article is what led to the investigation in Congress that led to the hearing that you're learning about today. Journalism matters, and it should be supported. And if you support what I'm doing, please contribute to this podcast, which is listener-supported at congressionaldish.com. Thank you if you've already done so. Anyway, at this point, when the USA Today article was published, it was the spring of 2021, and it happened in the Biden years, which all conventional political wisdom would indicate should lead to EPA leadership that would give more of a damn about policing industry than the Trump administration. And so what did the Biden EPA do? Well, following the USA Today investigation, EPA met with Elanco to again ask them pretty please to update the warning labels. Because since that update to the German label, which lists neurological problems as a possible side effect, that label has become standard in the entire European Union. Also, Seresto labels in Colombia were changed to say that the collar is, quote, highly toxic, unquote. And Australia's warning label now calls the collar straight up, quote, poison, unquote. But Elanco told the EPA that there was no reason to update the U.S. warning label. And the company was allowed to get away with that again. New administration, same response. One of the best members of Congress in regards to consumer protection, Representative Katie Porter of Irvine, California, brought up this label situation in the hearing with the CEO of Elanco. And here's how that went.
The EPA asked Bayer, the predecessor here, in 2019 to help the agency collect data on adverse incidents for cats and dogs using the Seresto collar. EPA asked Bayer to split the registration for cats and dogs so the agency could better understand and evaluate the risks for each type of pet. Bayer refused, saying that that change might have, quote, an adverse impact on sales. And they also said, quote, it would be a substantial increase in work. Mr. Simmons, are you willing to make that change and split the registration for cats and dogs as the EPA requested, or do you believe it's too much work?
I am willing to engage with the EPA on anything that the scientific data and the engagement under the regulatory body of the EPA merits the right thing to do. We believe the 80 studies and all of the pharmacovigilance data that we've submitted to them stands that this is a safe product.
Does the label in the United States have language like highly toxic or poison? Yes or no?
It does not.
Okay. So the warning label here in the United States, though, does say that mild reactions may occur. It mentions hair loss, scratching, and redness. The most severe symptoms listed are eczema and lesions. Does this label mention, this is the warning label, does it mention the potential for death?
It does not. And again, the label is...
So a pet owner looking at this label that we're looking at would have absolutely no reason, no way to know that Seresto may have caused roughly 100 pet deaths. That's what both the Canadian Pest Management Agency, the PMRA, and the EPA found. Will you change this label so that it includes death as a possible side effect?
Congresswoman, we do not believe the scientific data warrants a label change. And again, that is not just the 80 studies that were submitted. There's been 20 additional added studies since, and all of the oversight data that's been done on the 33 million pets over the 10 years. So again, following an EPA-regulated process, we're always open. If a data warranted some need for a change, we would do that.
EPA has to act. And not with a pretty please. This company is telling Congress straight up that they will not warn us about the internationally known dangers of deaths caused by this product. And forget about recalling it. That's not even being discussed right now. But this is the situation at the EPA. Again, here's Nathan Donnelly. He's been studying this nonstop for 7 years.
EPA has no trigger for review of any pesticide product, no matter how much harm is being reported. And because the agency has no mandated trigger for reviewing pesticides like Seresto, rather than choosing to use incident reporting data to inform a robust regulatory process and take dangerous products off the market, EPA routinely chooses to do nothing at all. And that's especially troubling when you consider that Seresto is just one of 18,000 pesticide products currently approved by the EPA.
And Karen McCormick, who used to work at the EPA for 40 years as a scientist, she thinks she knows why this is happening.
A number of the scientists, and this is not unusual, feel that the decision makers are not considering the science, and they're making decisions based on political reasons. I think some of the people at EPA are programmed to go along with whatever industry says. It makes life easier for you. You can go home earlier, and you can also get promoted easier if you go along with what industry says. It's unfortunately a problem there. And I've seen it over the years, and it's very hard to do something about it.
Corporatism in America rears its ugly head again. You know, we have a pattern of law enforcement refusing to enforce the law on corporations. During this Congress, we have learned about baby deathbeds that stayed on our shelves for a decade because the Consumer Product Safety Commission can only ask pretty please for recalls. We learned that infant formula and food in general is not being policed much at all by the drug-focused Food and Drug Administration. And now we're hearing that poisonous pet collars are being ignored by the EPA. Investigation after investigation. We're learning that federal law enforcement agencies are not doing their jobs. But the thing is, it's often by design. Because my entire life, deregulation has been a goal of the people Americans keep electing to Congress. Deregulation, stopping regulation, handcuffing the corporate cops. This is what it looks like when that goal is successful. Maybe it's time to reverse that political trend. But in the meantime, apparently, we're all individually responsible for policing the safety of everything we buy, I guess. And based on what I heard in this hearing, I certainly am going to play better safe than sorry and assume that the Seresto Flea and Tick collars are not safe. And so what you can do to protect yourselves and others is, first of all, tell everyone that you know who has a dog or a cat, especially if you see a plain-looking gray plastic collar around their little friend's neck, about what you heard today about the Seresto collars. And please share this episode so that more people can tell everyone that they know. And if your pet gets sick, and if you think this collar might be a factor, report the illness directly to the Environmental Protection Agency, because those are the only cases about which the EPA has all of the information. Only cases reported directly are not filtered by a company that's trying to keep its #1 product on our shelves. And to make reports not only about the Seresto Flea and Tick collar, but any kind of pesticide problem that you experience or someone you know experiences, you want to email report.pesticide.incident@epa.gov. And that email address will live in this episode's show notes for you on congressionaldish.com. And so what happens from here, there's actually some good news, which is that the EPA might be getting in some trouble for this. Because the EPA's Inspector General, so that's the guy who polices the EPA, the Inspector General announced an investigation on May 19th into the EPA's response, or more accurately, a lack thereof, to all of these reports of pet illnesses and deaths linked to the Seresto collars. But what happens after that report is finished, what happens to the Seresto collars and to all of the innocent pets and people who might be harmed by them, what happens to them is up to you in November. Because this committee will continue this investigation if the Democrats keep control of the House of Representatives. I have no doubt that Chairman Krishnamurthy will call the EPA Inspector General to testify about their findings when that report is done. And I'm pretty sure that he'll haul in some EPA officials to explain themselves as well. But the main point here is that I have full faith that this committee, in Representative Krishnamurthy's control, will continue this investigation. And here's why. Here's the man himself.
And so because of the tremendous number of pet incidents, the tremendous number of deaths, even when factoring in sales, I sadly have no choice but to recommend that the EPA commence a notice of intent to cancel proceedings and to fully investigate what's going on with the Seresto collar. And I respectfully request Elanco to voluntarily recall these collars at this time, pending this further investigation.
So that's what the Democrats are aiming for if we keep them in power. And the Republicans were very clear about their plans if they are able to take power as well. Here's Representative Andrew Clyde of Georgia.
I feel obligated to begin by stating the obvious this afternoon. Today's hearing is a colossal waste of time and resources.
That was a sentiment that was so universal among the Republicans on the committee that this is what the highest ranking Republican on the committee, who would likely be in charge of this committee if Republicans win the House in the next election, Here's what he did during his opening statement. Here's Republican Michael Cloud of Texas.
As someone who was sent here to serve the American people, I know that the American people are bewildered that we're having this hearing and that this is one of the top topics in Congress right now with where we're at. And I know the people who elected me to serve would prefer we be spending time on other important issues at this juncture. And so with that, I would move to adjourn.
I watch a lot of hearings. Probably have seen hundreds at this point. And I've seen this game played before where the opposing party tries to stop a hearing from even happening. But I've only seen that happen in the most political of hearings, the ones that, quite frankly, I tend to ignore. But I've never seen this happen in a consumer protection hearing. This didn't happen in the hearings about, disgusting conditions at the infant formula facility or in the hearings about Fisher-Price's Rock and Play sleepers of death. Generally, hearings about products that kill our loved ones aren't full of political drama. But that's what the Republicans did in this hearing about a product that could have hurt or killed my Abby. And that wasn't just a comment that he made. It was a real attempt to stop the hearing because he then requested a recorded vote. And at the time that he did that, there were more Republicans in the room than Democrats. And if a clerk had been standing by to take the voting roll, it could have worked. But the committee had to find a clerk to take that vote because this is not the type of hearing where there would be any votes expected. There's no reason for a clerk to be there. And so these shenanigans delayed the start of the hearing by 15 minutes. But basically, the Republicans were hoping that enough Democrats would be a few minutes late that they wouldn't be able to overrule the 5 Republicans during that vote and that the hearing would be canceled. Which is why they were in a very big hurry to get that vote to happen. Here's Republican Byron Donalds of Florida speaking to Chairman Krishnamurthy.
Mr. Chairman, it's already been about, a minute and a half? Where is the clerk? Is the clerk on lunch and not here today?
I think the clerk's on the way, Mr. Donalds. Thank you.
Is the clerk sitting in the side office just hanging out? I mean, come on, Mr. Chairman.
And I don't know if the Democrats were trying to stall and buy time by telling the clerk to wait a little bit until the Democrats could show up. I don't know. And I honestly don't care because the Democrats did show up and they won the vote 6-5 and the hearing happened. But the fact that the Republicans tried to stop this hearing, which I think is quite important. I love my pets. I also love children who are around the pets and all of the humans that could get sick from these things. I do not understand why they would do this and try to stop the hearing from happening. And then when the hearing did happen, the Republicans, I cannot say that they meaningfully participated in any way. Because in the information that I've already presented for you today, you've heard from most of the witnesses that were called by Democrats. The only one you didn't hear from was the woman who cried her way through her testimony about her dead dog. But here's who the Republicans invited and to whom they directed every single one of their questions.
My name is Carrie Sheffield, and I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Economic Opportunity at Independent Women's Forum. We are a nonprofit organization committed to increasing the number of women who value free markets and personal liberty.
And with her as their witness, here is the topic that they just kept going back to over and over again. 23 times, to be exact.
Out of all the economic concerns keeping the American people up at night, namely 40-year high inflation, and more inflation, I'm afraid flea and tick collars just don't quite make the cut.
The latest Consumer Price Index report revealed that inflation hit 8.6 in May compared to a year prior.
Consumers are burdened with the inescapable reality of skyrocketing inflation.
Inflation is at a 40-year high. Inflation.
Inflation.
Inflation. Inflation.
Inflation. Inflation.
Inflation.
Inflation.
Inflation.
Inflation.
Inflation.
Inflation.
Inflation.
The Republicans didn't direct any questions towards the scientists. They did not show any concern about the Seresto Flea and Tick collars. They didn't show any concern about my Abby or your little cat or your dog friend at all. And I've seen Republicans do a lot of things as a group that have made me mad. But this was a level of callousness that was shocking to me. even after all these years of watching political nonsense in Congress, this is one that I just couldn't handle. And I've tried to find a reason for it. I looked into Elanco's lobbying, and that company has spent a few $1 million on lobbying in the last few years since they bought the Seresto collars from Bayer. And Elanco does have a lobbyist currently, a dude named Ryan Canfield, who might be influential with Republicans. He was the legislative director for a Republican congressman, Hal Rogers, who is one of the most powerful Republicans in Congress. Hal Rogers was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee for most of the Obama years, and that's the committee that passes out all our money. And this Elanco lobbyist, Ryan Canfield, was in charge of that guy's office for a good chunk of that time. And then, after leaving that job, the Elanco lobbyist became a special assistant to President Donald Trump for a few years before leaving that job for this current lobbying gig. So he might be influential with the Republicans. And people who work for Elanco have given money to members of Congress for their campaigns, but they're far from heavy hitters, and they split the money almost evenly between the two parties. So it's not like Elanco is making it rain on the Republican Party. Following the money this time, it just didn't explain to me this level of callousness towards the health of our pets, towards this issue, and the humans in our families who are also exposed to the poisons on these pet collars. I couldn't find any reason for the complete lack of given shits exhibited by every single Republican on this committee. And so in November, if you choose to vote for a Republican, you're choosing to empower these people to control this committee. And that means that this investigation will clearly be over because the Republicans couldn't have been any clearer in their behavior. You heard it for yourself. And so, in a lot of frustrating ways, and I talk about this all the time, I get very frustrated with the ways that Democrats and Republicans as parties in Congress are way too similar. I'm very angry a lot about the endless increases for war funding, which are always bipartisan. I get angry about the bipartisan refusal to eliminate insurance companies from the center of our healthcare system. And they're just universal campaign finance corruption at the heart of both of the corporate parties. But the parties are not the same. And in this case, the difference couldn't have been clearer. One party acted in this committee to protect the pesticide industry. The other party acted to protect your family, your pets, your kids who snuggle those pets. They acted to protect you. And as frustrating as the Democrats are, this difference matters. I want this investigation to continue, and I want more investigations like it. And I won't forget that in November. So I really want to tell you about the experience that I just had in Berlin. It was a work trip that I took for a couple of days. I left Warsaw, which is where I'm recording this right now, and went to meet my We're Not Wrong co-hosts, Justin Robert Young and Andrew Heaton, to record a live show. And I'm going to tell you all about it. But unfortunately, I do have to take a second right now to let you know that support for this show, for Congressional Dish, has been unacceptably low in July. And I don't understand what is going on, but we are going to end the month of July making less money per episode on Patreon than we did in June. So the money's going down. And then after I released Pharmacy Benefit Managers, which my co-hosts do think that maybe one of the problems with that episode is that super boring name. So maybe people aren't listening to it. I don't understand what's going on. But the usual number of Venmo payments and Zells and PayPals, like the payments that come in from people that want to pay not regularly, but when they hear an episode that they like, those just didn't come in July. And I've got to tell you, or maybe I don't have to tell you, but I am going to tell you that this other show that I'm doing is already getting some pretty impressive Patreon support. And it's a lot easier and a lot more fun for me to do We're Not Wrong. It just is. And with the amount of work that it takes to read bills and laws, to wrap my head around what pharmacy benefit managers are and explain them in a way that I think most people can understand, maybe I failed at that. I don't know. I don't think I did. all of the feedback I've gotten on that episode has been positive, and so I don't understand the corresponding decrease in funding for Congressional Dish. So basically what I'm telling you is that I am feeling like you are telling me that this show is less valuable to you than it used to be. If that is not the case, please contribute to Congressional Dish. I will not fill this show with advertisements. That is not an option because there are episodes like this one where I need to tell you about some multinational corporations that have done some shady shit. And I can't do that if I am dependent on companies for the funding. So I have to depend on you. The way that this works is I provide a podcast episode for you that has intrinsic value, information you're not getting anywhere else, or something that maybe you have heard of, like pharmacy benefit managers, but haven't had explained to you and what their role is in the healthcare system. I give you all of the sources for everything that I tell you in the show notes so that you can check my work yourself. You don't have to trust my opinions about the topics I'm telling you about. You can go down these rabbit holes for yourself. I make that as easy as I possibly can for you. And I pay to make that happen. It's not free. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort, but I think that is what makes this show more valuable than others. And so when I do all this and the money doesn't come in, I am being told by the market, by you as the market, that this is not that valuable of a show. I need to be told that is not true if I'm going to continue to make Congressional Dish my number one job. If you do want to support this show, if you do find it valuable, please go to the support page on congressionaldish.com. Use whatever method works for you, but please support this show because the money's going down. And that is just not how a valuable business grows. And I would also like to thank everyone who is already paying for the show on a regular basis. You are the reason this show still exists, especially on weeks like this. And I would like to thank specifically Randall Dibble. Randall has been paying for this show for so many years. He's one of those people that has sent in a lot of payments. And so I've seen his name forever. And so I'm so excited to share the byline on episode number 200, How to End Legal Bribes, with my new executive producer, Randall Dibble. For those of you who aren't in the know, executive producers are people that support the show at a level of $535 or above. It doesn't have to be a lump sum. The way Randall did it was through a bunch of payments over the years, and it's added up to $535. We do keep track. All you have to do is ask us we keep track after 2017, which is when my sister came on board and started doing my accounting. That's when we actually know what's going on. But over the course of years, Randall's payments have added up to $535, and hence he got to put his name on an episode of his choice, one that he was especially proud to produce. Along with his executive producer credit, he has a note for the community, and so here is what Randall had to say. He said, quote, "I have chosen episode 200 for my executive producer as the system of government and how our elected officials are elected is at the core of all other governmental issues. The two main issues being, number one, politicians with more campaign funds in 2020 won their race in the House 88% of the time and in the Senate 71% of the time." And by the way, you guys, he gave us his source for that, and we'll put that in the show notes for you. But back to his note, he said 71% in the Senate being the lowest win rate since at least 2000, which just shows the influence of money in our politics, doesn't it? Excellent stat. Thank you, Randall. And then he said, number two, politicians are choosing their voters instead of the other way around. I agree with you that H.R. 1 was never really a serious attempt to correct this problem. Most of the politicians are more worried about maintaining their own power than to make substantive changes. Politicians from a polarized state or district, primary way to lose power is to allow the groups selecting them to change. In our system right now, primaries are the most effective way to replace a politician. And he said, on the topic of maintaining power being the primary goal of leaders, I recommend the book, The Dictator's Handbook by Alistair Smith and Bruce Bueno. Thank you so much for those stats and that recommendation. And of course, for supporting the show for so long, Randall. I am so happy to have your name on an episode. Okay, so I want to tell you about Berlin because the coolest thing happened to us there. So we all met up in a bar. There was I kept calling it the bunker, but Justin found us a private room in a bar that we could record in for free. And so that is where we did our live show. And we did have 3 people from Berlin come to watch us record the show. They were all there because they were fans of Andrew Heaton specifically. And what was amazing is one of them brought his girlfriend, Tanya. And Tanya came and sat next to me. And right before we went on the air, I'm talking within 5 minutes, we introduced ourselves very quickly, and Tanya mentioned that she was Ukrainian. That's all I knew about her. And so I started recording the episode, and while I've been here in Warsaw, one of the things I've been doing is volunteering at an incredible organization that deserves all the support in the world called the World Central Kitchen. Basically, what the World Central Kitchen does is it takes amazing food. It's food that is created by a famous chef whose name is escaping me right now. And he's not working at this one because they have these tents all over the place. But they put up a giant tent at Warsaw's main train station. I'm staying at a hotel across the street from it. And for 23 hours a day for now almost 6 months, they have been feeding Ukrainian refugees. The refugees, all they have to do to get in there is show their passport, and they can have as much food as they want for free. We have water bottles, sandwiches. I've served sausages and goulash, and the food is amazing. So they're not only getting meals, but they're getting really good, high quality meals. So I'm so impressed with the entire organization and everybody I've met there. The people that are working there are absolute superstars. Like most of them that I worked with, or at least I'll say about half of them, were Americans, which was shocking to me. But a lot of them are people that came here right after the war started and have been working there every day now for 5 months. And the way that they afford this is a wide range. So one of them is a Georgetown professor, and he has been here during the summer. So obviously he can pay his own way for this. But someone else that I met is an Amazon supply worker, and he said that he's going to stay here until he literally runs out of money. And then he'll go back, and he wants to be an Amazon delivery driver when he gets back, because he says working in the supply rooms is actual hell. It was fascinating to meet these people, and it was such an incredible experience. But one of the things that I wasn't able to do was to speak to any Ukrainian refugees, not because I didn't have the time, but because very few of them speak English. Actually, it was very tough in the tent to even learn a few words, because I wanted to learn hello, enjoy, you're welcome. There were a few words I was trying to learn, but when they were speaking to us, they were speaking to us in Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian. And all of those languages are super foreign to me. And it was just kind of impossible. And so I gave up. Plus, I was working with Ukrainians, and so they were able to translate for me no matter what language was thrown at us. So, and it was an amazing experience. But I did want to meet some Ukrainians because of how long I have been following their story. Since 2014, I have been doing a bunch of episodes now, at least 5, I think, about the role our government played in switching their government from one that was partnering economically with Russia to one that was going to economically partner with the West. I have tracked the way that we have quite literally funded the creation of the Ukrainian military over the years. And it's just a story that I have been on top of for a very long time. So I wanted to meet some Ukrainians. And then, like a miracle, when I'm about to go on the air, a Ukrainian who speaks damn near perfect English was sitting right next to me. And so if you listen to our episode of We're Not Wrong that was recorded in Berlin, I was asked by Justin, because he knew I was volunteering here, about my experience with the Ukrainian refugees. But I gave the microphone over to Tanya and let her have most of the time, because she should have most of the time. So if you want to hear from her, listen to We're Not Wrong. But what happened after we recorded that episode, Tanya and I became very fast friends, and we got into details, and we talked about 2014. And I talked specifically about what our government's role in the revolution was. And what was fascinating is Tanya was one of the people, she was one of the protesters who participated in that revolution. And so we had a very nuanced conversation about what was happening in Ukraine. And so What I am going to do is, for everyone who pays for this show, I have for you something I call my green room. Most people access it by pledging per episode on Patreon. That's how you can get it instantaneously. Or there is a jerry-rigged way to get you that private feed if you want to pay by paper check or some other method. But Patreon really is the easiest. But I'm going to put up the Patreon episode that we recorded for We're Not Wrong. I'm going to put that up on my green room too. And I'm going to give you more details because I feel like the Congressional Dish audience has been talking about Ukraine much longer than most other American outlets, actually. So I'm going to give you more details about our conversation that didn't make it onto the microphone. And then you can hear the episode that we recorded. Now, here's the thing that's a problem. Our conversation was getting really good, and I had microphones in my bag, but we were in a crowded bar at this point. We had left the underground bunker, and so we were outside. And unfortunately, my co-hosts are very loud men. So even though Tanya and I were trying to low-key have a conversation on the mic, you really have to focus to hear it. And I do apologize for the sound quality, but I feel like the quality of the conversation is so good that if you're interested in this whole Ukraine situation and hearing an actual Ukrainian talk to me, of all people, about what happened in 2014 and how she feels about our role in the coup, which is what I've been calling it for years. But I talked to her about what happened in 2014 and how she feels about it and how she feels about what's happening now. And her family is still in Ukraine. She just returned from Ukraine 2 weeks ago. So she has been there. She knows what it's like. And that's what we got into on that Patreon episode. So right now I'm going to give you a little taste of that conversation so that you can hear if the sound quality is something you can handle. But also I just want you to hear a little taste of Tanya, because she is one of the most impressive people I've ever met in my entire life. And I'm just so honored to be able to share her with you. So here is a little piece of our conversation. Enjoy.
I was a kid at that moment, and I wasn't really understanding what's happening. I was just following my gut, and I was kind of like following what I think is right, even though I had a lot of opposition from many of my friends, especially from my relatives. Lots of them were saying that I'm dumb for being part of the revolution of dignity and everything like that. Why were they saying that? Because they were saying, and what will you achieve with this revolution of dignity? Like, so what that, I don't know, you can now travel to EU, or so what that we are going to follow democratic elections. I don't care. What I care about is, I don't know, my bread to cost the same amount as it cost last year ago. So there was a lot of accusation about us and Russians being brother nations, that we're so dependent on each other. So it's not true. Now we know it's not true, because the brother nation wouldn't come and kill another brother nation.
What she said at the end there was wouldn't kill another brother nation. And so, yeah, Tanya and I in that episode, we talked for about 35 minutes, and the boys hadn't noticed that we were mic'd up. And then in the second half of that episode, everybody gets a microphone. It becomes a group conversation. And so if you would like to have access to that, all you have to do is contribute on congressionaldish.com, and that will be there for you. All right. Thank you so much to those of you who are supporting this show. I am looking at what to do for the next episode, and it looks like the so-called semiconductor bill is going to be law, and so that's what I'm going to work on next. I do know that Joe Manchin appears to be participating in the Democratic Party, and there is a bill that used to be called Build Back Better and is now called, I think, the Inflation Reduction Act. I know there's a lot of people curious about what's in that. I have looked at it. It is 745 pages, so it's quite a project. But I've seen Lucy pull the football on this too many times, and so I'm going to wait before I start to read that to make sure that this is, in fact, the final version. So the next episode is going to be about semiconductors. That's a pretty hefty lift itself, and like I said, the money is down right now, as is my motivation to do this. I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull off 2 episodes in August. So yeah, I will get the semiconductor bill episode to you when I can, but I really do need you to support the show. So please visit support the show page on congressionaldish.com. Like, this is, it's frustrating to me to see the way the money rolls into shows that feature political opinion and to see them funding for this one go down. I'm hoping you guys will step up and reverse that trend. So yeah, thank you to all of you that are helping me do this. And I will talk to you as soon as I can. Until then, be safe, take care, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.